I'm Greg Wheatley, and I'm joined today on Inside Wheaton by Larry Eskridge. Larry is the Associate Director of the ISAE at Wheaton College. That stands for the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals. He also serves as guest faculty at Wheaton. He is the editor of the Evangelical Studies Bulletin, and we want to talk a little bit, too, about a couple of other things that he's been responsible for as we move through our interview here today. But, Larry, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for spending some time with us.
You're welcome. I've been looking forward to coming in and talking.
You are the, around here, I would say, one of the historians extraordinaire, and particularly your area of interest is really the place where American culture and evangelicalism and in some ways popular culture all kind of come together, right?
Yeah, the intersection between that, media, and pop culture, that's really
How did you come by that interest?
I dare say probably just natural interest and sort of observation as I was, in terms of being involved in the church and seeing that there were some pretty strong opinions about the extent and depth of Christians' involvement with popular culture. So that whole question sort of intrigued me. And growing up, as a baby boomer, we were certainly surrounded by pop culture and media, so it was grabbing for our attention.
Hard to escape that, isn't it? It brings up an interesting point, though, because a lot of times I think what we do, the academy tends to push that to the side. Maybe not so much anymore, but that takes us right to the heart of your book, which is called God's Forever Family: The Jesus People Movement in America. And I think, Larry, for me, the fact that this book is published by Oxford University Press kind of blows my mind. They're obviously taking this very seriously as a historical moment in America.
Right. Well, the argument we try to make is that the Jesus People movement, which was this thing that sprung up in the mid-late 60s, mostly on the West Coast, but not entirely, really was an important moment in the youth culture and in American culture and American religion during that period. The fact that it sort of evaporated a few years afterwards, I think, led a lot of folks to think that, it was just sort of ephemeral. It was
flash in the pan.
It was a flash. It was a fad. But behind a lot of that was the fact that there were changes. Folks grew older and they matured and they moved on with their lives, but their direction had been altered quite a bit by their involvement in the Jesus People movement. So we're trying to go back and let's see, what was all this thing really about?
Give us some years so that we can dive into this and kind of get a thumbnail sketch of the movement.
Okay. Really, the first real identifiable, Jesus people / Jesus freaks is what they were referred to in the counterculture, really show up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Key in 1967 in Haight Ashbury, the summer of love. They're right there. These guys are
you going to San Francisco, right?
Be sure to wear flowers in your hair. Yeah. And some of these guys had them, and right there. And it really moves on from there to where the movement takes off in Southern California a year or two later. And 1971 is a year of a lot of publicity and national media coverage. And like anything with the national media and coverage, eventually it has a season, and then eventually they move on. It made the cover of Time magazine in the summer of 1971, and usually that's a sign that something's going on. And but by about 1976-77, the movement had really begun to fade away, and there were a lot of different reasons for that. But sort of 67 to 77,
about
if you want to give it a
decade.
Yeah.
A lot of us, you and I were just talking before we started this interview about our age. We're very close to the same age. We're kind of we can remember sort of the aftermath. I don't think we have great memories of the very beginnings. But we were old enough then to remember sort of as this thing kind of cranked up and got going.
Right. I think, for a lot of folks who were particularly involved outside of Southern California and also who were maybe a few years younger, after the publicity phase of 1971 is where it really attracted a lot of folks' attention. That's where you get a lot of people who were high school age and people in, kids and youth groups in conservative evangelical churches who begin, they start wearing the crosses and the buttons and really identifying with the Jesus people. And, that's really pretty much where I came in on this. But
let's go back to the beginnings. It's fascinating to read your book, I will say this parenthetically: if you want a really good description of this movement, and especially if it's kind of nostalgic for you, you'll really love this book because it's very, very well done. Let's go back, Larry, to the beginnings. Haight Ashbury, you talked about that, and some of the ways that these people started to catch the vision for ministry. I think it really is kind of mind-boggling because these were people fresh themselves.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In the drug culture,
very fresh, right?
Yeah,
It was a kind of a strange marriage almost between. The earliest people who really have become the leading figures in this Haight Ashbury group were a fellow by the name of Ted Wise and his wife Elizabeth and some other friends of his, who you might actually describe more as beatnik because they were a little bit older and they came out of this sort of avant-garde bohemian thing from the 50s. But they were in contact with the younger kids on the street, and they began to attend a Baptist church in Mill Valley, California, which was pastored actually by a Wheaton alum, a fellow by the name of John McDonald, who graduated from here in the 40s. And as they began to interact, it was a little bit of a rough marriage, you can understand. But McDonald and some of the other Baptist pastors in the Bay Area there really began to realize, almost like a missionary sort of an outreach, that they were not equipped to reach these folks who were, coming to San Francisco. And there were 75,000 to 100,000 kids who came to San Francisco during '67, the Summer of Love. And they were seeing all the chaos, and they realized that they did not have what it took to reach these people. And so as a result, they began to back Ted Wise and his friends, and they opened up a mission straight there in the middle of the Haight Ashbury. And
in missions terms, this would be contextualizing.
Exactly.
I mean, they had to figure out how to contextualize this message. There's a moment where you tell a story about one of these people who had come to Christ, come to faith, and yet still, were taking drugs. Right. I think even LSD. Yeah, there was this period where they had to kind of sort that all out.
Right. It was probably, later on, people who've been involved with the Jesus movement later on would sort of realize and recoil that this could have been a possibility. But early on, they were coming straight out of this counterculture. And as one guy said, there were no thou shalt nots, about smoking marijuana, for example. And so, it really had to dawn on these folks that maybe the drug taking is irresponsible in a lot of ways, financially, physically, in terms of my health, preventing me from what I should be doing, in support of the gospel. And so it did take a little while for that to register for a lot of these guys.
Two things jump out at me when I think back to this period and when I read about it. And one is that there seemed to be a return to a pretty simple gospel message. The other, and some of this has to do with music. I'm a musician, so the music is particularly interesting to me. A really heavy emphasis on the second coming.
Oh, yes.
I talk about those things and why spiritually, why sociologically, why do those things come to the fore here?
Okay, I think they were very basic and open in their approach to Scripture, and this idea that they just sort of accepted the fact that they would be able to communicate with God, and that the Bible, really they sort of out-fundamentaled the fundamentalists in a large degree. They read the second chapter of Acts, and okay, well, we'll take that sort of literally.
And they formed a music group.
That's right. Yeah, that too. That's an example of the sort of thinking that was going on. And so there was just kind of a innocent openness to just, we'll be able to read the Scriptures, understand them, and apply them, and we'll be just like the first century church. So that was almost a natural outgrowth of the meeting. In terms of the second coming, again, you're looking at the Scriptures. They see Christ promises to return. They look at the book of Revelations, as a very intriguing book to them. And you also have to remember the context of the mid-late 60s. And for those who may not have experienced it, it was incredible. I mean, you really thought the the United States was certainly unraveling, and the world situation seemed incredible. You had Bible teachers who were going around making a particular emphasis on fulfillment of last days prophecy. The events with the Six-Day War and the capture of Jerusalem. So a lot of these folks were really just taken by this whole idea of biblical prophecy, and it seemed like, we are in the last times. These folks expected Jesus to come any time.
It would have been the days, maybe shortly after that, of Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth.
Yeah. And Hal Lindsey actually sort of honed his material at a communal house off the campus of UCLA, where a lot of these countercultural folks gathered along with college students. So it is said that the late great Planet Earth was the, next to the Bible, that was the second most important book in the Jesus People movement.
It was a manifesto.
Yep, exactly.
Well, that's kind of a nice segue into music, because the musical component of the Jesus movement is huge, isn't it?
Yeah, it really was central to the whole movement. In a lot of ways, it probably couldn't have certainly been as large as it was without the musical component.
Yeah, and let's listen to a little bit. Anybody who harks back at all to that era is going to...
The question, why should the devil have all the good music? Yeah. The kids at that particular time didn't quite get the old strictures against worldly entertainments and popular music, which, a lot of the conservative churches held very strongly, and there was pretty much a generational rejection of that sort of attitude. And the Jesus people said, if we're going to communicate with our peers, if we're going to spread the message, and if we're going to worship God the way that we know how, we've got to do it in our own musical idiom. And rock and roll, pop music, folk music, that was what they used.
Yeah, rock and roll also, though. I was watching, just before we came in here, Larry, I was watching a little portion of a documentary on the Jesus movement. And there was a pretty lengthy, very interesting segment where they showed some groups singing. It wasn't all the get down rock and roll.
Oh, no.
There was a lot of sort of contemplative, laid back, which is interesting, I think, because you see some of the fruit of that even now in some of the praise choruses.
Oh, very big. Yes.
There's a lot of historical roots there, aren't there?
Yeah, some of the various artists, Love Song. You mentioned the second chapter of Acts. A lot of these were very biblically and scripture oriented in terms of where their lyrics were coming from, and to sort of convey those sorts of ideas, it's hard to do that in a guitar crunchy power chord setting.
Yeah.
So, that was really sort of a natural outgrowth. And you also had the phenomena, the fact that as these folks were moving into the churches, they were bumping heads with people who were not necessarily real sure about all this. Chuck Smith at Calvary Chapel, he kind of liked the folk and the pop, but when it got to be rock and roll, it made him very nervous. So you see that reflected in some of the music that was coming out of there.
Well, Larry, I'm kind of a second chapter of Acts fan, so I know a little bit about their music. I'm just thinking, so much of their music, it was characterized by this sort of heartfelt longing for you to know what I know.
Right.
This sort of invitation-like, why don't you look into Jesus? Because so there was this sense of, and that's why I said earlier, this sort of simple gospel appeal. Jesus is the one. I mean, in some ways, it was cut right down to the simple, bare facts.
Right, and this music was meant to be very evangelistic. Now, whether, especially as time went on, how that really translated in terms of the audience and everybody, it really was this idea that, folks are bringing their friends to these coffee houses and to these concerts, and, the message is in the song, and it's not... It wasn't quite like a worship service necessarily, although that was certainly present in a lot of these. But there was also this sort of evangelistic punch that, was maybe a little different than what you would normally see.
How did this, talk about how this migrates then into the more conservative, the typical Midwestern youth group who's picking up some of the emphases of the Jesus movement?
Yeah, well, I think the huge publicity flap that comes in 1971, on one level you think, well, this whole, why wasn't there more publicity earlier on? Because you have this sort of strange, man bites dog characteristic of hippies, reading the Bible and out here, preaching on the street corners. But the 1971 publicity phase really tended to, get the word out there. And Billy Graham played a pretty large role in that publicity because he really embraced the Jesus people and put it front and center during his 1971 Crusades. And that was a pretty valuable service for the movement, I think, because for a lot of folks, particularly in these conservative churches, pastors, youth pastors, parents who might otherwise have been resistant, well, Billy Graham's kind of giving it, right, he's giving it a thumbs up, with some reservations occasionally, but usually it was very enthusiastic. There's an anecdote about the 1971 Chicago Crusade. There was kind of a big incident there, but one of the Jesus people from Milwaukee was down passing out the Jesus papers at this meeting, and he said before the meeting started, people were avoiding eye contact, wondering what sort of strange bunch of people these were. But after the meeting, when Billy Graham sort of gives them the the go-ahead and the seal of approval, the folks were out enthusiastically accepting their papers and praying for them and giving them donations. It had a huge effect.
Yeah, if Billy says so, it's good.
That's right.
The question arises, Larry, in all of these movements, and I'm not sure it's one we can humanly answer. Right. But the question about, is this a blip sociologically? Does this represent a true religious, or we would say a revival movement? Talk about how you sort through that question.
Yeah. Well, for historians, it's kind of a tough issue because you're trying to basically argue some sort of a sacred, scripture-based theological event, and you're writing to a academic audience that doesn't share that particular conversation. Right. And even on the larger level, it's hard for, I certainly don't have God's eye view on what's going on there. But if you put it within the context of other large movements, it certainly seems that the 60s with the Jesus People movement, you could also probably fold in the charismatic revival at that time that was very big, that something was definitely going on. And, it really made a pretty big impact.
And you could say probably at the very least, the religious landscape of America today would be much different had it not happened.
I believe so. I think a lot of these young people who were touched, who were in the counterculture in particular, you think about some of the tremendous changes that occurred with the 1960s in terms of various cultural sorts of things that happened and went down, either positive or negative. You begin to realize that changes in, say, sexual behavior, the drug culture, how far and how pervasive might those have become if this movement hadn't taken place just right at that time? Certainly in terms of the growth of the evangelical church, you could make an argument that this was kind of key in holding on to a generation, who
that could have slipped through the cracks.
Through the cracks. Were they in danger of leaving their parents' faith? A lot of these church kids we were talking about. So in that sense, the Jesus movement might have provided kind of a lifeline, sort of a bridge between their youth popular culture and their church and their religious values and beliefs.
Larry, this is great. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I want to mention a couple of things. Larry's book is called God's Forever Family, the Jesus People Movement in America. And again, I recommend it if you have an interest in that period of time at all. You'll find it a really fascinating read, God's Forever Family. And then I wanted to say something about you've produced a 6-part DVD series called People of Faith, Christianity in America, which is part of ISAE's offering.
Right. It was one of our projects from a year or so back.
And then I know your office is really busy these days with a fall conference called The Worlds of Billy Graham. Just say a word about that.
Yeah, this is a part of a project, a grant that we received, and it's a conference being held here in Wheaton, September 26th through 28th. We'd love to have you at the conference, and it's really an attempt to try to gather some pretty good scholars to let's look at Billy Graham within the context of America, in the sort of second half of the 20th century, early 21st century. What did he mean? What sort of important issues did he deal with? And, what made Billy Graham the phenomenon that he was?
For all of that, you can go to wheaton.edu, look for the ISAE page. Just plug it in the search box if you'd like, and you can find out all of that information. Larry Eskridge is Associate Director of the ISAE, the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals at Wheaton College. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Greg.
For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley. I'm Greg Wheatley, and I'm joined today on Inside Wheaton by Larry Eskridge.